one of the most popular hymns sung by Christians. Probably one of our favorite songs, period, is the hymn Amazing Grace. A big part of its appeal is that it is deeply, deeply personal. You and I can identify with the sentiment and the subject as much today as it did with the author John Newton back in 1779. Most of the people who love this song are familiar with the background of the hymn, and that adds another layer of intimacy in the song's singing. Before he was an Anglican pastor, John Newton was a ship's captain involved in the Atlantic slave trade. His involvement with his human cargo is loathsome enough, but every other aspect of his life at the time was equally degenerate. As the story goes, Newton was at sea on one of these trading voyages, and he encountered the worst storm he had ever sailed through. Fearing for his life, he cries out to God, and he believes that he was delivered from the danger of perishing out of that prayer. Newton marked that as his moment of conversion, but the change in his life was not immediate. He continued to sail his terrible trade route, transporting enslaved human beings for another couple of years, even after that moment. It took some time for him to see the wretchedness of his life and his spiritual condition before he could write the lines to the song about God saving a wretch like himself. Now, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much of an awful human being do you really think you are? Remember, most of us haven't murdered anybody or traded slaves, so how bad could we really be? This is more than a rhetorical question, because the gap between how wretched we think we are on the one hand and our need for grace on the other is often a lot wider than we think it is. This disparity is usually a result of us using our definition of grace and then applying it to God rather than taking the extraordinary grace portrayed in the Bible and applying it to ourselves. Wretchedness or guilt for us is usually this sliding scale, and fortunately, there's always someone worse than us that we can point to and see, that guy over there, that's wretchedness, and then I'm not all that bad in comparison. The result of that mindset is this sliding scale for grace. That guy over there, for sure, the one that's more wretched than yourself, they for sure need a ton of grace. Me, I only need a little bit of grace around the edges here, and oh my goodness, my sainted grandma, she needs even less. That all sounds good, but it is terribly unbiblical. Let's talk about our need for that amazing grace in today's episode of Walk the Walk, brought to you by the Hope Community. Grace is amazing to us only when we put it in the proper perspective to our true spiritual state before God. When the Apostle Paul writes that all have sinned and we all fall short of the glory of God, we don't find any sliding scale. God doesn't grade us on a curve. To say that all fall short of the glory of God, all, means that every one of us, no matter how good or well-behaved we are, all of us fall woefully short of the holiness necessary to be in relation with our perfectly holy God. And whether we miss the mark by 1 point, just this much, or like that guy over there, by 1,000 points, it doesn't matter. Missing the mark is completely falling short. There is no close enough. The only way for the image bearers of God to move from the first stanza of Amazing Grace, a wretch like me, to the second stanza where it says, I once was lost, but now I'm found. The only way for that to happen is if God does the moving. It is only accomplished through the immeasurable grace of our God. Our spiritual state is not necessarily the same as our outward behavior. You may be the nicest person ever to walk the earth, but the Bible describes you as being dead in your transgressions. We may have an exemplary attitude and an incredible compassion towards other human beings, loving them and filling their lives with kindness, and yet our hearts are dreadfully wicked in the eyes of God. It is possible to be a good person, an acclaimed person, a loving person who lives by the laws of their land as perfectly as possible, who goes through their entire life doing nothing but good for other people, and yet without the grace of God, all of us are still in enmity with Him. The reason for this is simple to state, but can be difficult to swallow. Because of Adam's rebellion in the garden, all of humankind who would descend from him, and that's everybody, all of us are tainted by sin in God's economy. No matter our efforts to be obedient and loving and kind and all those kinds of things we believe should mark us as worthy, all of them are worthless. They will never attain to the level of holiness required to be reconciled to God. Keeping that in mind, we have to remember there are no gray areas in the courts of God. There is only black and white, guilty, not guilty. It is impossible to be just a little bit guilty or mostly not guilty, a good person, not such a bad guy in our modern hierarchy of culpability. Holiness, perfect, blazing holiness, is the standard. And that is defined by the character of God. He is holiness. For us to be holy would require that we match Him one-to-one in morality, ethics, behavior, purity, and so on. And we would have to do that perfectly, without any hiccups, without any issue in our life whatsoever. Not just mostly good, perfectly. Since God cannot be in the presence of unholiness, we, on our own, cannot make it back into union with Him, so long as even one rogue thought or shadow of deceit exists within us. We need help. We need a Savior. We need grace. It is that realization, that moment when these two challenges collide in the human heart, that the magnitude of God's grace becomes real for us. Grace is not compared to our mostly goodness or our somewhat obedience. Grace comes into the icy glare of reality when held up against our total inability to redeem or purify or save ourselves. When we realize that the mark of holiness is unreachable by our own efforts, that our ever-wavering hearts are always harboring some outlaw thought or desire or impulse, it's that moment where we see grace for what it is. We see the grace shown by God in Jesus as the undeserved gift that it is. We realize that grace is the only way for us to be accepted into the full presence, into friendship with God, our Creator. We compare the offer of salvation by faith alone, that we are made not guilty, and our hearts of stone replaced by hearts of flesh in an instant, to our inabilities, and say without question how amazing grace is. When you and I are clear-eyed in viewing the immeasurable distance between ourselves and God, His grace in sending Jesus as the propitiating sacrifice leaves us speechless. Without any plea of our own, the fact that God offers complete forgiveness to the unforgivable, that He pardons those who will place their faith in the person and work of Jesus, this drives us to our knees in humility. Once blind, now we see the stark contrast of our efforts and attitudes against God's love and mercy and the sparkling beauty of grace. And we know for certain that this grace is truly amazing. This love, this inexhaustible love that God shows for us doesn't drive us to libertine excess. It compels us to live in a thankful manner, to seek holiness in our lives. We grow in love for our Savior to the extent that our love for Him pushes out and outweighs our innate love for ourselves and for our rebellion. A diamond is beautiful in itself, but it becomes spectacular when placed against black velvet, enabling all the fire to be seen as the light passes through the sharp cuts and those polished edges. John Newton saw the blazing fire of God's grace against the blackness of his life, and he described this contrast in the second verse of Amazing Grace. "'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear." That speaks to that moment he and you and I realize the piercing light of God's purity and holiness in contrast to his state of imperfection and inability. When he followed that with, "And grace my fears relieved," in an instant he saw a lifeline, a rescue coming through Jesus. The twin effects of grace give us hope and bring our lives and the holiness of God in sharp contrast. We recognize the cost of our forgiveness, the horror of the sacrifice necessary for our salvation, the precious gift of grace offered to us. Friends, my prayer is that we all are rightly amazed at God's grace. Dear ones, let yourself be amazed. Know the full blessing of what God has done for you. God bless you.